I call the Honourable Member Catherine Delahunty.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker.
Tēnā koe, Mr Delahunty.
Tēnā koe te whare paramata me tēnā koutou Ngati Haua. He mihi nui ki ngā mana ne rangatiratanga of Ngati Haua. I'm very privileged to speak on the second reading of this bill. It is my privilege to be a resident in the Hauraki and to be therefore in the neighbourhood of Ngati Haua, and to acknowledge at the end of the rohi of Hauraki their Ngati Haua's strong interest and relationship and whakapapa connections to Te Arawa, the maunga ātāhua in our area, the beautiful mountain that we are working to restore from pollution. I'm going to take a brief call because in the third reading I'd like to expand on some of these issues, but I think the most critical issue is the need to bring the Pākehā community into an understanding of what Ngati Haua and other tangata whenua groups have been through, so that we can actually say things have been settled. And I think a number of Pākehā might know the name Wiramu Tamihana Tarapipipi and the word kingmaker, but have no real concept of the extraordinary leadership of this tupuna, the history of his descendants, and everything that he and his people went through during the land wars of the 1860s. And so it's really important to acknowledge his descendants here today and back in the rohi, who have carried on since those times to assert their mana and rangatiratanga despite the incredible process of violence and colonisation that took place in their rohi. And of course, the Waikato, being one of the most fertile and beautiful parts of Aotearoa, was in the sights of General Cameron, in the sights of the colonial settlers, and they were determined to wrest that land from its rightful owners. And much of that land is now in private hands, and thus a conundrum when we talk about full and fair retribution and justice for Ngati Haua and other Waikato people. The classic issues are involved in the settlement, but first to acknowledge the effectiveness of this particular negotiation in this time. Obviously, Ngati Haua had initiated an excellent negotiation with the Crown, and within 6 months had reached an agreement that represented the best that could be negotiated. And I think that we should acknowledge and celebrate that, while also stating the Greens' refusal to accept that settlements are full and final, and that these deals can never be the end of negotiation. And the reason that I say that is that we know that issues like what Patricia Grace just experienced with the Public Works Act, even though it ended in victory, we know that discussions around post-treaty settlement monitoring are not entrenched in the settlements. They rely on the goodwill of the government of the day, and that's insufficient. We cannot just rely on the goodwill of the government of the day in post-treaty settlement monitoring. That's not sufficient. We actually need, if we're going to make a proper settlement, we need to recognise the absolute legal obligation on the Crown under the Articles of Te Tiriti to continue dialogue and negotiation forever, so that we can attempt to live in right relationship out of the mess that colonisation created in Aotearoa. And so goodwill and willingness by each government isn't sufficient. We cannot rely on the fashion to support Te Tiriti depending on who is in power. We need to entrench those values and those articles of Te Tiriti into these processes if they're going to be meaningful. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleague who said on the previous bill that Matiria Tura, that while the process is designed by the perpetrator, it's pretty difficult to see that the redress is going to be appropriate in all senses. No matter how much good work has been done, it's an imbalance of justice. I want to talk about war because the Waikato War is not written on the wall of this building. I'm looking forward to the day that we acknowledge the wars in our own country as well as the wars offshore. And I think we've had a recurrence now of acknowledging Aurako, Rangiriri and Poki Hina, for example, but they're not on the walls of the Parliament. They're not expressed as a true part of our history, and that does not do them justice. They are the most painful wars we were involved with because they strike at the heart of our identity as a nation, and they strike at the heart of some of the myths of our nation about how we live together. But when they're on these walls, I'm going to have faith that we've truly taken on Te Treaty. The other issue in relation to Ngati Haua is that I read the aerodrome provisions with some interest. The Public Works Act in the 1940s and 50s was used to divest these people of their whenua. And at the moment, the settlement talks about the future, but what it does give them in concrete terms is the right to sit on the parking committee. And I don't think that's what justice looks like. And to say that one day they might get the aerodrome back if people no longer use it, well, that isn't really justice either. One day, when those people who like flying their planes around decide they might like to give the land back, I'm not sure that's justice. So I'm interested in truth and reconciliation being meaningful. And this is not truth and reconciliation when one of the parties, i.e. the Waikato Pākehā community, have no idea not only of the content of the settlement, but most of them, but also with what happened in Ngati Haua, what was done, and what conditions people have to survive with. And even the good things that are in the settlement, they don't really come to grips with those either. Now, really interestingly, the constitutional review process that the government and Māori Party led talked about the need for these issues, and in their report they talk about the need for Te Treaty education and civics as being critical if we're going to create a genuine reconciliation to history and therefore a real settlement of the treaty process in Aotearoa. But the constitutional review recommendations have not been followed through it as far as we can tell in any meaningful way. There was a discussion in Parliament yesterday on this very matter, and it wasn't at all clear who was going to take responsibility for making sure that genuine, robust Te Treaty education based on what happened at Waitangi on February the 6th in the Te Reo treaty signed by the chiefs, by the rangatira, will actually have any place in the education system. Words are one thing, but we are way overdue. So if we're talking about Ngati Haua settlement, we need the people of Waikato, the Pākehā community, tauiwi katoa, to really understand what has taken place, what has been done, and what is being returned, what is not being returned, what are the finished business, what is the unfinished business, and how they as citizens under Te Treaty, who are protected by Article 1 in terms of kawanatanga, have a responsibility to work in right relationship under Article 2, rangatiratanga, with the tangata whenua, the mana whenua of Ngati Haua or anyone else in the Waikato. So, we talk about co-management, co-governance, all these models, but we haven't got a basic understanding in the Pākehā population. And I know this because I've taught this subject for 20 years, that the Pākehā population has no basic understanding of what the Articles of the Treaty mean in terms of their responsibilities, or that the settlement process is actually their process. And I'm one of the few very privileged Pākehā who speak in this House about this. But I do that because Te Treaty of Waitangi is the most important issue for Pākehā in Aotearoa me tauiwi katoa. Tangata whenua have never given away their rangatiratanga, and Te Treaty doesn't give it to them. It merely affirms the existing reality that has been damaged and that we are now attempting to heal. But we, as Pākehā, my people, we need to understand, and no more significant than in the Waikato, what happened and how we have a role in supporting the restitution and justice for Ngati Haua. So I'm looking forward to the day that this constitutional conversation actually leads to proper Te Treaty education so that every citizen can stand up in the Waikato and say, what happened? What happened with General Cameron? What happened in the burning of the women inside the church? What does that mean for me? How can I understand that? Not in a way of feeling paralysed with guilt or shame, but in a way that to feel empowered by history to live in right relationship and support a settlement such as this one, and to make the settlements in future ongoing, robust and meaningful and justice-based. Kia ora tātou katoa.
I call the Honourable